In today's video, we are going to take one of the easiest blocks and we are going to turn it into a disappearing 4-patch. And we're also going to turn another one into a surprise. Get your sewing gear and let's get to it. For today's quilt block, you're going to need 4 pieces of fabric. Now my pieces of fabric are going to be 4.5 by 4.5 inches square because that's the size of the ruler that I used to cut them. But you can make these any size that you like. And we're going to go ahead and put our 2 together and our other 2 together. We're going to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance on all of our seams today. Now on my sewing machine, I am using a leader because I've been having issues with my thread wanting to come undone, and the leader just kind of makes things a little bit easier. So we're going to go ahead and sew that 1/4 inch seam all the way down on both pieces of fabric. Once you get that complete, you can press these, but I am actually doing a finger press because I just have limited space and it's gonna work just fine for this application. It's not really that crucial at this point. Now we're gonna put all 4 of our pieces together and we're gonna put them right sides together. Now you want to make sure that your seams are pointing in opposite directions just like this, and they'll be nice and nested, and once you sew them you'll be able to have a nice intersection where they all come together. We're going to go ahead and do a 1/4 inch seam allowance right down there, and this is what you're going to have when you get done, and look how perfect that aligned. I actually got it right one of these times. Again, we're going to do a little bit of a finger press instead of taking it to the ironing board. I've actually got one of these tools that I believe is used for wallpaper, but it actually does a pretty good job if you just want to give it a nice little rolly roll, just like that. So now this is your basic 4-patch block. Currently my block is sitting at 7.5 inches by 7.5 inches. Now a lot of times you can just kind of leave it like this, but we are actually going to do a little bit of a variation called a disappearing 4-patch. And what we're going to do for the disappearing part is I am going to cut 1 inch away from that middle seam on both sides. Now, of course, if you don't want to do the disappearing part, you can just end right here with the tutorial, and you can actually take your 4-patch and you can put a sashing around it, kind of like this. This is a little bit what it would look like if you wanted to put a border or a sashing around it. For my cuts on the first version of the disappearing 4-patch, like I said, we were doing 1 inch away from that middle seam. My little ruler is 2 inches, so it makes it pretty easy. So, of course, here comes the scary part. But it's not that scary if you've got a rotary cutter to make things nice and easy. But we're just going to go right down that side of the block. And then we're going to go and do the exact same thing on the other side, 1 inch away from that center seam. Now, once I did the first cut, I actually looked at this block and I felt like that it was a little bit too narrow for my liking. I don't really like to fiddle with a whole lot of little pieces of fabric, but since the deed was already done, I went ahead and did the other side because there was no going back once the fabric is cut. So just something to keep in mind if you're doing your block. And of course I got my blocks out of frame and had to put them back because I need to just mark my cutting mat, the parts that are in frame, but that is something for another day. So once you've got everything cut, you're just gonna kind of lay it out, kind of like a jigsaw puzzle. I had to put everything back where it was just so I could kind of see what I was doing. But once I got everything laid out, now you can start playing with your orientation of your pieces. And so I actually messed with this a little bit. I did the outsides, then did the insides, and a little variation of both just to kind of get it how I wanted it to look. But if you start your 4-patch with 4 different patterns, you have a lot of different orientations that you can do when you start rotating things around. Now, later on in the video, I'm actually going to show you a different variation of this using 2 different patterns instead of 4 different patterns, and you can see the difference. But right here, what I'm doing is I'm putting all of my pieces together, and there does tend to be a lot of seams when you do your cut this small. Again, I'm not really a huge fan of having a lot of seams like this. This is kind of how I stick with big patchwork whenever I'm doing a project. I've just always gravitated towards larger squares and the larger patchwork look. But sometimes I will mess with crumbs, but this one, you know, again, since we already had everything cut, we just went ahead and rolled with it. But for me to try to make sure that this stayed as straight as possible, I used all of the clips in the world. Not all of them, but I did use quite a bit. But now, once you've got everything together, your rows and your columns, this is what you're left with. And the end result did turn out pretty nice, I will say that. But it was just a little bit smaller than I expected. But I think that that's a pretty fun little pattern. But yeah, you've got your small blocks here, and you've got these longer strips here, and now your finished block size, once everything is cut and sewn back together, is going to be 6 inches by 6 inches square. So you can see how much yardage that you do lose whenever you make these disappearing blocks. So something to keep in mind whenever you make your initial measurements. Again, like I said earlier, I did try this block again, and I used 2 different patterns instead of 4 different patterns. And instead of 1 inch away from that center seam, I did 2 inches away from the center seam. And based off of the measurements, I did not plan for this to happen. But once I took everything apart and started changing the orientation and everything, I just turned my 4-patch into a 16 patch, and it was not planned at all. But I went ahead and rolled with it and got all of my columns and my rows together. That's just something to keep in mind, that if you do start your 4 block with 2 different patterns, then you can just make a nice easy 16 block. And once everything was sewn, this was the result. But yeah, that's how you take a normal and standard 4-patch and turn it into a disappearing 4-patch and a 16 patch.